going to present to you our strategy document. This is our Headwater Mercury Source Reduction Strategy document. It's a real thing that you can get online, print out, and read. It covers a lot of background around mercury and the science behind our understanding of how it moves through our watersheds, but it also gets specific into actions about what can be done about this legacy issue. So I'm going to cover a little bit of background and then go into each one of those areas. Keep in mind that the strategy document is a living document, and that what that means is that it's never done. It's something that we continue to take comments and review on so that we can continue to make it better and obviously update it and improve it as we go forward. So with that, we'll start with just some background. I know that some of you have seen this slide before, but believe it or not, it's the starting point for all of our work here at Sierra Fund, it seems like. So this is a map of California and all of the abandoned mine lands on it. The gold are gold mines and the red are mercury mines. And you can see how many of them are in the Sierra Nevada. There's these two types of mining, hydraulic mining and hard rock mining. And when we started working on this topic, there was this there's so many of them. There's more than 40,000 abandoned mines. What can be done about it? Impression about this topic. And really, this strategy document, one of the reasons I'm proud of it is that it gives a new message in that if we focus on one type of mining, hydraulic mining, and one type of contaminant, mercury, then we can make real tangible progress on this legacy issue, on addressing this legacy issue. So when we started this, these were some of the misconceptions or data gaps that were surrounding this issue around mines in the Sierra Nevada. So there are so many of them. What can you do about it? They're in the middle of nowhere, which is not at all true. If you live in the foothills, you know that mines are in a lot of the lands that are within the city and usable space that we're around. And then there was this misconception that all this mercury had already washed out, and so it wasn't affecting where we lived anymore. And that also really was an oversimplification and not true of what the legacy issues were that we're still living with. So just a little bit about hydraulic mine sites and what they look like. Because of how they were mined with these monitors that essentially power washed away the topsoil, what we see on these mine-scarred lands, these hydraulic mine sites today, is real active erosional areas. So they're denuded mostly. You can see some vegetation is growing back. There's also features on them with drain tunnels, ditches. Sometimes there's ponds, gullies and head cuts that continue to erode and expand, and these multiple outflow points of discharge when it rains during storm events. And some of them have ongoing issues associated with discharge. That gives you a little bit of a visual of what I mean by a hydraulic mine site and what it might look like if we were out there walking on it. So one of the things we've been up to is sampling, and not just sampling, but sampling for trace level metals, so at very low detection limits and during events. This kind of changed our way of thinking and really helped us, again, find meaningful activities that we could take to address the legacy mercury issues. So by taking samples during storm events, this is a picture of us sampling at Malakoff Diggins, where all of the water that flows into Malakoff Diggins pit flows out of one point, the Hiller Tunnel. And that allowed us to make really good, accurate predictions of what the mercury loads were and what the sediment loads were from this one iconic hydraulic mine site. And that's us sampling upstream of the mine site, at the mine tunnel discharge, downstream of it, and then where it comes together. What this type of sampling allowed us to do was define the type of mercury that was still coming from these hydraulic mine sites, this particulate bound mercury, so mercury associated with the fine silts and clays. And this picture is meant to clarify that, so that if I took a sample, 2 bottles, and filled them up at Hiller Tunnel, they would both look really turbid, like the picture on the left, right? And then I send them both to the trace metal lab, and they filter one of them. And then they analyze both samples, the filtered and non-filtered, for mercury. And the difference between the two is the mercury associated with the fine silts and clays. And that's what we call this particulate bound mercury. And you could imagine it like a little bead of mercury on a piece of silt or clay. So that's different understanding, right, about where mercury is coming from, when it's moving, and what form it's moving in. We worked on this issue with a really wonderful body of experts that make up our technical advisory committee, and they review the things we write. They've reviewed this strategy document, they provide comments, and they've greatly improved our ability to talk about this issue and given us meaningful feedback along the way. So I just in no way want to leave that out and say that we did this all on our own. This is really a group effort and continues to be a group effort. It's still an understanding in progress. But these are the guiding principles that we've been able to distill out of the literature to date. And I've put some references on here, and then I have a references slide at the end. And I'm going to go through them because these are the things that allow us to say and form the strategy, right? So mercury is primarily bound to particulate fine silts and clays during winter storms, and it's transported in that form. Mercury can be transported long distances from the source areas, like mine sites, and it can accumulate in reservoirs where the water velocity slows and the transport excuse me, capacity decreases. Mercury methylation typically occurs most efficiently during these warm summer months and in anoxic zones that establish at the bottom of these reservoirs. Mercury can be methylated when sulfur-reducing or iron-reducing bacteria are allowed to develop in the low-flow anoxic conditions. And then the primary exposure pathway to mercury is through fish consumption. So these being our guiding principles from the literature, we worked with an artist to create this rendition for our conference that we held, releasing our strategy document last October. And it distills what I just said in really technical terms into a visual display of art, right? It shows these hydraulic mine sites scattered throughout the topography, and it shows the reservoirs where that water is flowing from the mine sites down into the reservoirs. It shows that the mine sites are surrounded by forests, and then it shows that exposure is occurring when people are fishing and eating that fish. So though this picture isn't super technically satisfying to me, I do think that it captures the basic conceptual thinking that we're implementing here as part of our strategy document. And from that, we were able to identify these different targets. So our strategy document has 4 targets. One is the hydraulic mines and mine features, right? The other is the forests that surround these mines and these mine features. Then reservoirs where that material then accumulates behind and can change form. And then of course, mercury exposure via fish consumption. So with these 4 targets in mind, we created this strategy document. And again, I encourage you to check it out, read it, provide feedback to us, and remember that it's a living document. But what it represents is our effort to put together what can you do about it strategy for mercury associated from legacy contamination issues still coming from these hydraulic mine sites. I'm going to go through what we can do about it, one target at a time, except for the first one, which I'm going to cover together. For hydraulic mines and mine features and mercury in forests and land management, these are our 4 actions that we've identified. First and foremost, we need an inventory and a database of these hydraulic mines and their features. Then we've got to go out and ground truth these features. That means going and visiting the sites. We can't just do it as a desktop analysis. We have to actually go visit those sites. And when we do that, we collect information on attributes that are at the site, both physical hazards and chemical hazards. Then we're going to develop pilot projects, and we have developed pilot projects that allow us to evaluate different mine remediation treatments. We rank and prioritize hydraulic mines and mine features for remediation, And from this effort, we're able to make recommendations and evaluate these best practices for remediation. So the LiDAR data that we have for the entire Tahoe National Forest has really allowed us to make progress on the inventory effort. So in the LiDAR environment, you're able to see the denuded areas of the hydraulic mine sites much better than you can from, say, the satellite imagery that's on the left. And this delineation has taken place now throughout the Tahoe, actually, but we started with just one stub watershed at a time with a graduate student and a volunteer from the Forest Service. We did the Willow Creek, Oregon Creek, and Washington Huck Sub watershed or units as part of a master's student that I helped advise from Chico State. And so what this picture is showing you is the delineated areas of hydraulic mine sites in the Willow Creek subwatershed. This flows into New Bullard's Bar in the Yuba River watershed. This is somebody out there in the field taking notes in her smartphone. And so this app, this is the Avenza app, but you could use a collector app as well. We've set it up to collect information on a series of characteristics or features so that we have some standardization of information collection going on at each site. And that information then becomes part of the database. So if I'm out there walking around and I see a drain tunnel, I can GPS that location simply with my smartphone, right? I could take samples and indicate where I took those samples and then later put that data back in. So Nick Graham has made great progress. He's our environmental scientist at the Sierra Fund, and he's taken the whole Tahoe National Forest, for which we have LiDAR data, and started this hydraulic mines database. Right now we have 456 hydraulic mines or mine features in this database. So wait, when I started, I said, or I hope I said, there were over 40,000 abandoned mines in California, and that number was just huge, right? What can we do about it? Well, now we're talking about 456 hydraulic mines or mine features in the Tahoe National Forest. That's a much more manageable planning unit, if you will, that we can get our heads around. So therein, by getting specific, we can define more meaningful action. So for each one of these features then, it becomes a matter of collecting information on the different attributes of each one. And we don't have all of these, but these are the ones we've brainstormed so far. And we're making progress on these in a defined area, the Tracker Project in the Tahoe. So we could have information about permitting that's going on. We could have information about historic information, about the records, how much gold was mined from there, or the years that the mining took place, the methods of mining that took place there. We can have information about ownership and features that are on the site, but we can also have information about habitat for species of special concern or fire risk. So you can see how useful this database and the attributes for each mine site could really be. The LiDAR allows us to make other calculations that are really meaningful, specifically how much material was removed by the hydraulic mining operation. This is by looking at digital elevation models of current topography and then a modeled topography that we create or interpolate so that we could say how much material was removed. We subtract those from each other and we have the amount of material exhumed. And we've published on this topic already. These methods in LiDAR are still being developed, but seem to be very, very helpful at telling us exactly how much material was removed. Think of this a little bit like going backwards in time and quantifying a mountaintop removal effort, right? So that gives us not just surface area of a hydraulic mine, but how much material was there and distributed downstream. And we can do this for deposits that are in waterways as well, looking at how much material is still stuck in these lower order streams is really informative for understanding how much is still coming down. So that's why we always say this is an inventory of hydraulic mines and mine features, because deposits like this still exist in the main water courses, and this would be a mine feature. And in fact, this one is behind a debris control dam that was constructed and is holding back a lot of this. That's a cement structure in the middle of nowhere that won't last forever, and that's the amount of material behind it that could potentially be mobilized if that structure were to fail. All right, so how do we know if we're making progress? In a strategy document, you have actions, and then you want to have evaluation criteria for how we're doing. Well, our goal here is to continue this inventory effort for one sub-watershed per year throughout the Forest Service area, the Tahoe National Forest, and maybe even being able to expand into the Plumas. We want to have a pilot remediation project every year so that we're working on mine remediation techniques and we're able to monitor how well those work. We want to make sure that we coordinate what we learn into regional regulatory and planning efforts. So it does no good if we do an awesome pilot project, learn about something, but don't move it into other efforts and other discussions that are going on and other regional planning efforts that are taking place around the regulation of mercury, like the TMDL effort. And then we also want to develop funding mechanisms that allow us to increase the pace and scale of mine remediation. And we may have funding coming in for this. We haven't been given the award yet. But basically, how do we increase the pace and scale of this effort? Can we really continue to do it one state grant at a time? Or is there a better way to include downstream beneficiaries into this and increase the pace and scale of mine remediation, just like we're doing by increasing the pace and scale of forest and fuels treatment? That's why I wanted to cover this topic together, because with respect to forest and land management, our evaluation criteria are really similar. We need sampling plans, sampling and analysis plans that allow us to evaluate forest management activities that reduce mercury. So if you're in there already doing a forest health project and you're removing fuels, you're reducing the extent of catastrophic fire, right? And what effect does that have on mercury fate and transport? Has it decreased it because the fire won't be so catastrophic? And then are there other things that you can do while you're in there doing that fuels treatment project, like add chips to a hydraulic mine site or biochar that you could create on site that would reduce the amount of mercury? So the successful design and implementation of a pilot program that integrates fuel reduction with mine remediation activities is what we're talking about. And we actually have one of those going on right now. This is the Trapper project area that the Tahoe National Forest is completing NEPA on as we speak. This is a 31,000 acre planning area. And on this area where Forest Service needs to go ahead and do fuels reduction activities, there's 135 different hydraulic mine sites. So this brings up a lot of issues. If you're in there doing that work, can you leverage the fact that you've already mobilized, you have earth moving equipment in there, you have crews in there? What can you do to those mine sites to, say, reduce the amount of erosion taking place, or better yet, reduce the amount of mercury taking place? Those are connected. So what can we say so far about best management practices with respect to hydraulic mines and forestry? Well, for mine sites, we know that minimizing the erosion of contaminated material is key. And we also know that keeping water away from contaminated areas is key. So we've articulated those in the documents already as best management practices. And these are other ones that we're still exploring and developing around mercury and forest. So the fuels treatment to reduce fire severity, how does that affect mercury? Can we apply wood chips to denuded areas to reduce erosion? And can we apply biochar to contaminated soils to reduce mercury transport? Not just can we apply biochar, but how can we best apply biochar? In what ways, in what application techniques work best? And that all comes with taking data before and after, having control sites. All of that comes from continuing to learn and incorporate that into this strategy document. All right, so the third target is around reservoirs. And as I've explained, we have in our conceptual model, sediment still moving downstream and filling up these reservoirs. Reservoir sedimentation taking place in the Gold Country is really unique because that sediment that's coming downstream has hydraulic mining debris in it and has mercury contamination. So once that mercury contaminated sediment is in the reservoir, it can methylate and become part of the aquatic food web. So there's a couple processes going on with mercury that make really low levels that we might be detecting from these hydraulic mine sites really meaningfully significant levels once they reach the reservoir environment. Mercury increases with every trophic level in the food chain. So very low levels in water and sediment can result in dangerously high levels in top predatory fish. That has to do with the biomagnification that's taking place with each food chain, and also the fact that each large fish lives for a long time. So there's bioaccumulation going on in any in every step. So we have both biomagnification and bioaccumulation of mercury taking place. And this is key because the primary exposure pathway to mercury is through fish consumption. So I always like to clarify, it's not a swimming or a problem. It's not really even a drinking water problem. This is a fish consumption problem. So people are exposed to mercury when they consume sport fish in the Gold Country, and they can be exposed to dangerously high levels depending on which fish they're eating, what size that fish is, from where it is, and how much of it they eat. So let's talk a little bit about reservoirs. Reservoirs fascinate me because they are these man-made environments, and they're not going to last forever just if we just do nothing, right? They're man-made environments that require continuous maintenance activities. And if we don't do these maintenance activities, then they are going to fill up with sediment and no longer provide the water storage function that we as a society are relying on. And so if there are these maintenance activities going on, what is the effect of those activities when you have mercury contamination? Well, these first two images in the upper portion are meant to identify reservoir management activities that would reduce the amount of sediment coming into the reservoir in the first place. So I love this document, and I have it in my reference section at the end, so you can take a look at it. But what are they? Land stabilization, that's a mine remediation technique that can definitely be included in hydraulic mine remediation. And check dams. Check dams of all sizes can be used to slow the transport of sediment and water from these mine sites, and perhaps there's a way to make them more effective than they are. But that's the first step to reservoir maintenance, is controlling upstream sources. Once the sediment is already in the reservoir, then you have to consider what removing it in the wet would look like, or the impact it would create to mercury with removing it with a hydraulic dredge, or removing it in the dry and what that would look like, or this mechanical excavation step, right? And that obviously would have much less to no water quality impact. If you're actually removing in the dry, you're not creating a water quality problem. So that's just an example of how some of these regular reservoir management activities that need to take place need to consider mercury and legacy mercury contamination. So the key actions we've identified in this strategy document is that first we need to know what reservoirs are impacted by legacy mercury contamination, and in the Gold Country, I would say that's most all of them. Second, we need baseline sampling. So we need to have an understanding of what the current conditions are in these reservoirs with respect to mercury, so that we have something to compare it to after the reservoir maintenance activities take place. So then we need reservoir sediment management pilot projects to occur and have monitoring be a part of those. And then from that, we're able to make recommendations and evaluate best management practices for reservoir sedimentation projects that have legacy mercury. So I've articulated a couple here. One is removal in the dry with excavation to avoid water quality impacts. The other is to minimize disturbance during the warm season so that you're not stirring things up and making them more bioavailable during this time where mercury methylation and food chain activity is really high. And the third is avoid creating low oxygen conditions in stagnant water. And this can be part of dewatering sediment deposits so that you can remove in the dry, but also reservoir operators have used this to basically stir up and avoid stratification in reservoirs so that you don't have that anoxic zone at the bottom. And sometimes that works to some effect. So how do we know how we're doing, right? Or how do we evaluate whether or not we're implementing this strategy? Well, we hope to be able to develop at least one sediment removal project per year in partnership with reservoir managers. We want to help design monitoring plans for these reservoir sedimentation projects that are led by the reservoir managers. We want to identify mercury reduction best practices for the removal and maintenance activities that I spoke about. And we want to share these monitoring strategies with others so that the information can be used and improved upon. And of course, we want to coordinate best practices into a regional regulatory and planning effort like the statewide reservoir TMDL for mercury. I thought I'd give you just a teaser on some of the projects that we've been involved in. Keep in mind, we have an entire presentation planned on the COMBI project, so I in no way want to steal that thunder. But this is a great example of a pilot project we've actually been working on since 2009 to remove this sediment that has accumulated in the upper portions of Lake COMBI. And the way in which we removed it, it was informed by everything that we learned along the way. This was a project led by the Nevada Irrigation District, and we had a lot of monitoring take place as well with partners like USGS and others so that we could evaluate the effectiveness of these different removal techniques. So what I wanted to highlight about the COMBI project in particular with this presentation was the extensive monitoring that we planned with our partners at USGS and that USGS actually implemented. And this monitoring is expensive. I mean, getting fish tissues so we know the contamination level of the fish in the reservoir, you need many samples of many different species of fish. You also want to have vertical profiles of the reservoir and its environment throughout a range of different seasons before the project takes place. We want to look at different forms of mercury. So here we've called out total mercury, methyl mercury, reactive mercury, dissolved organic carbon, nutrients, chlorophyll A, other things that are interacting with the mercury methylation cycle. Looking at periphyton seems to be really informative, and in fact there was 5 different size classes of periphyton in some of these samples that allowed us to better understand how mercury was moving through the food chain. Looking at mercury in the sediment, in the pore water, which is the water at the kind of the benthic interface at the bottom of the reservoir, and the different levels that are going on there, and then finding ways to create real-time monitoring for mercury was a really great part about this project too. So that's what I mean by baseline reservoir monitoring that should take place with every sediment removal project. This is my ideal world, right? Before and after, so that we can really see what the impact is. And I get that that's not always possible, but at least here is our best advice. So again, just a little bit more of an update. So there's a reservoir in the Bear River that has these 2 different arms. This is the Rollins Reservoir. And you can see the hydraulic mining debris that's moving into them from these aerial photographs. So there's the Greenhorn side and there's the Steephollow side. Rollins Reservoir is a 66,000 acre-foot reservoir. It was built in 1965, and it's been estimated that it's lost about 20% of its water storage capacity because of sedimentation. So it's lost about 12,000 acre-feet. So it's always good to point out that maintaining these facilities, the ones that we already have, seems like a much better option than building new ones, for example. So there's an estimated 20 million cubic yards of material in Rollins Reservoir that could be removed. And in fact, NID has already designed different projects to take on this issue. And the one up in Steephollow is really interesting because it's mostly removal in the dry. That's what this means by skimming in the dry. There is a dewatering channel that's proposed to get the water over to one side of that deposit so that you have more of the deposit in the dry to be able and access to it with your earth moving equipment. Removal is an active part of the reservoir maintenance that needs to take place, or we won't have Rollins Reservoir, right? So NID has really been a leader in looking at this issue in their facilities on the Bear River, and we continue to support them in this effort. The other arm of Rollins Reservoir is the Greenhorn arm, and here's some historic photos showing that reservoir sedimentation coming in, and this is hydraulic mining debris moving down the Bear River. So this is 1993 photograph, and you can see the extent of sediment moving into the reservoir. And this is a 2008 photograph, or excuse me, 2018 photograph, so much more recent. And really we start losing access to the reservoir at some point. This is the campground over here, and where boats are launched and get into the reservoir. Well, this arm is definitely starting to encroach on that. And so NID has designed a sediment removal project for this, and they have mercury monitoring as a part of both of these projects. So hopefully we will continue to understand how mercury is moving and how these removal efforts affect the fate and transport of mercury. And then I wanted to mention in the most important reservoir sedimentation issue that we have in our region. This is, of course, Englebright Reservoir that blocks anadromous fish passage on the Yuba River. And I'm showing you here this profile of the sediment. And my point here is that if the water level were lowered, we could expose this deposit and be able to remove mercury and sediment from the reservoir. And if we were able to do that with a lowered reservoir, lower water table, we might also be able to install some sort of fish passage in fish ladder and allow fish to have access to this habitat. So by better understanding what reservoir maintenance techniques are in the Gold Country, what their effects are on mercury, we can inform really important projects like this. All right, so the last target I wanted to talk about today in our strategy document is mercury exposure from fish consumption. I mentioned to you already that fish consumption is the primary exposure pathway to mercury. And what that means is that people who are out there catching fish and eating them could be exposed to dangerously high levels of mercury by eating their catch. And when we started this, we started talking to people, and there was no posting on site. There was posting by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment online. But there was an outreach issue where people weren't getting the information on site or where they could use it. And also there was this kind of misunderstanding that most people didn't eat the fish that they caught up here, that they mostly were fly fishermen, or even that we had people coming up from the Bay Area where mercury contamination was better understood, and they were coming into the Sierra Nevada, into these clean Sierra lakes, which were actually reservoirs and had mercury contamination in them. And so there was a whole lot of education that needed to take place around this topic. So we identified the following actions in order to make progress on this. And the first thing we did was we did an angler survey where we talked to more than 300 different anglers on site about the fish that they planned to catch or that they did catch and what they planned to do with it. In other words, were they catch and release, or were they taking it home and consuming it? And of course, what their consumption patterns were over the previous 30 days. This was a survey created by Department of Public Health that we just adapted to our region. And by asking these questions, we were able to calculate people's methylmercury exposure. And this is another topic that we hope to cover as a lunch and learn coming up soon. The second thing we did is that we found out there were these water bodies that were listed as 303D, impaired for mercury, and then there were these fish advisories. But there were lots of water bodies that were listed that didn't have fish advisories. And so what we learned is that there wasn't enough data to make site-specific fish advisories for OWIHA to make fish consumption advisories. And so we did this regional fish tissue collection effort where we went out and caught fish according to a sampling and analysis plan that OWIHA approved, and then provided that data to OWIHA so that they could warrant a site-specific fish advisory if it was needed. So we used the angler survey data and the fish tissue data to identify water bodies with high risk of exposure. We then did the legwork of posting the state-issued fish consumption advisories. You see Amber here putting up the sign. Until very recently, there was no requirement that these fish advisories be posted, and so we led this effort. It's a volunteer day that was a lot of fun, came with the opening of fishing season to get that information out there. And then we use this survey data, fish tissue data, to inform targeted outreach and regulation actions by finding ways to make effective communication occur around this issue. So these were the different water bodies that we went out and did our angler surveys at. These were all 303D listed water bodies. And so knowing that mercury contamination was there, whether there was a fish consumption advisory or not, we went out and talked to anglers at those sites. And we updated our angler survey in 2018 and have it on our website. But this is two of the questions that we asked that are really informative. One, we said, have you ever heard or seen any health warnings about eating fish? And about 80% of the people that we surveyed said yes, that they had heard something. And then if they said yes, we asked them to tell us what they had heard. And we recorded this answer. And then we categorized the accuracy. We graded the answer for accuracy, if you will, because there's a lot of information that people need to put together in order to make a safe fish consumption choice, right? The person who says they've heard of these advisories, they need to know about the species of fish that they're eating, right? They need to know about different sensitive groups. So women of childbearing age and children are considered sensitive. They need to know about frequency of consumption, so how often it's safe to eat it, and they need to know about size, portion size. So all of those factors go into being able to make a safe choice. And so we were able to see that, yes, most people had heard of it, but by and large, most people were not able to make an informed decision around safe eating limits. So how do we know we're going to proceed? What are our evaluation criteria around this issue? Well, we have fish tissue data gaps that we've identified and filled, some of them, but I'm sure there are others, and we plan to expand that into other regions. We have made fish consumption advisories available in Spanish at CABI region water bodies, and we've posted them at those sites. We've worked on our outreach strategy and developed it for vulnerable communities like women and children and Spanish-speaking communities and DAC communities. Follow-up outreach to local public health officials to ensure that they're aware of the need to provide the information about mercury to fish. This is a really difficult one. Obviously, most people don't get very long with their doctor. Doctors don't like additional things to have to bring up. You know, there's a lot that they're trying to triage in those 15 minutes or so that they have with you. But there's very little awareness in the health community about mercury exposure through fish consumption. It doesn't come up a lot. And then we do plan to expand our survey and our efforts into other watersheds. It gives you a little bit of an update of where we've come so far. This is the references slide that I promised you all today. These are seminal references, but there are many more. And they are in our Headwater Mercury Source Reduction Strategy document. And so we encourage you to check some of these out. So with that, I just want to say thank you for joining us and giving us this opportunity to talk to you about our Headwater Mercury Source Reduction Strategy. We welcome your comments on it. And I also want to make sure that you know about these future Lunch and Learn series that are coming up.